Imagine walking into like a bustling state-of-the-art factory. The conveyor belts are humming, all workers are moving with this synchronized precision, and at the end of the line, these perfectly taped boxes are just piling up on pallets.
Right. It looks incredibly efficient.
Yeah, it looks like the ultimate picture of industrial productivity. But then you step a little closer, and you slice open one of those boxes and look inside, and it's completely empty.
Well,
You open another one, empty. And, well, when we picture a functioning math classroom, we have this deeply ingrained expectation of what active learning looks like for you and your kids.
oh, for sure. We look for the visual cues.
Exactly. Pencil scratching across paper, heads nodding in unison while the teacher speaks, worksheets being filled out with all these complex equations. It looks like a high-functioning factory of knowledge.
It really does.
But so there's this staggering statistic from Peter Liljedahl's research that completely shatters this illusion. When researchers actually measure cognitive engagement in traditional math environments, they find that up to 80% of students are not actually engaged in mathematical thinking at any given moment.
80%.
80%. I mean, they are producing the boxes, they're moving down the assembly line, but the boxes are entirely empty. So for today's deep dive, we are looking at the data behind why our math classrooms seem perfectly designed to, frankly, prevent thinking, and how the entire system, from the physical desks to human neurobiology, drives this massive failure.
Yeah, and it requires a fundamental paradigm shift in how we view education because, for decades, the cultural narrative has just defaulted to blaming the student.
Right. They're just not trying.
Exactly. If a child sits in a classroom and doesn't learn the material, the immediate assumption is a deficit within the child. We tell ourselves, well, they lack the intellectual ability, or maybe they don't possess the mythical math gene.
Well, I hear that one all the time.
Right. Or we just say they're simply unmotivated and lazy. But the data points to something far more systemic. The classroom environments we've built and the instructional models we've relied on for over a century, they actively discourage the very cognitive processes we are trying to foster.
It's wild to think about.
It is. I mean, we are looking at a failure of instructional design on a massive scale.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because wrapping your mind around the idea that 80% of a room is just existing without actually thinking is wild. Because if they aren't thinking, what are they actually doing? I mean, as a former student, I remember being exhausted at the end of a math class. It certainly felt like I was doing something.
Oh, you definitely were doing something. What you were doing and what researchers observe in these classrooms every single day is compliance.
Compliance.
Yeah, traditional education models heavily mistake compliance for cognitive engagement. Just consider the classic instructional model we've all experienced. It's often referred to as the I do, we do, you do method.
Okay, yeah, take me back to high school.
Right, so first, the teacher stands at the front of the room and demonstrates a procedure on the whiteboard. I do. Then the class does a highly similar, heavily guided problem together. We do.
Uh-huh.
And finally, the student is handed a worksheet to perform identical problems on their own. You do.
I mean, that is essentially the architectural blueprint of every math class I ever took in my life.
Same here. But analyze where the cognitive demand actually lives in that scenario. The heavy lifting of reasoning, of sense-making, of figuring out what mathematical tool to use and why to use it.
The actual thinking part.
Exactly. All of that critical thinking is monopolized by the teacher. The teacher has already done the intellectual labor before the student even picks up a pencil. So the student is left in this state of passive reception, relegated to mere clerical work.
Just copying.
Pretty much. They aren't required to think. They are only required to follow a physical sequence of steps.
And when a system only requires compliance, students develop strategies to provide exactly that, with the least amount of friction possible. The research outlines this fascinating taxonomy of what they call student king behaviors.
Yeah, that term is so perfectly descriptive.
It really is. These are essentially the coping mechanisms students use to avoid the friction of real thinking. Because, let's be honest, real thinking involves risk and vulnerability. And they identified 4 main ways this manifests. And honestly, reading through this, it reads like a playbook for surviving high school.
It's an economy of effort, really. Students are constantly calculating the risk-to-reward ratio of engaging with a difficult task.
So true. So the first behavior is slacking, which is overt non-engagement.
Yeah.
The student isn't doing the task. They might have their head down on the desk, or they're just blatantly talking to a friend.
They aren't even trying to hide it.
Right. But it's a high-risk strategy because it draws immediate disciplinary action from the teacher. So many students pivot to the second behavior, which is stalling.
Huh.
This is the subtle avoidance tactic. It's the student who suddenly realizes, oh, I urgently need to sharpen my pencil, which somehow takes 5 minutes.
Yes, exactly.
Then they need to use the restroom.
Yeah.
Then they spend an absurd amount of time color-coding their header before writing a single number. They are basically running down the clock to avoid the cognitive labor.
And stalling is highly prevalent because it often flies completely under the radar.
Right.
It looks like preparation, but it is actually just avoidance.
Which leads to the third behavior, and this one is brilliant in kind of a devious way, faking.
This one is so common.
It's insidious because the student looks highly academic. They are flipping pages in the textbook. They are staring thoughtfully at the whiteboard. They might even hold a pen over a blank piece of paper and nod sagely when the teacher makes eye contact.
Playing the part perfectly.
Exactly. But they are producing absolutely nothing. They have optimized their physical posture solely to avoid the teacher's intervention.
Faking is the ultimate illusion of learning. The teacher looks out, sees a sea of attentive faces, and just assumes learning is happening.
But then we get to the fourth behavior, which is the most common and perhaps the most dangerous, and that's mimicking.
Yeah, mimicking is where it really falls apart.
This is when a student successfully replicates the teacher's physical steps from the board to get a correct answer on their worksheet. But they have zero grasp of the underlying mathematical logic. It's like blindly following a GPS turn by turn in a brand new city.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, you follow the voice telling you to turn left in 500 feet, and you eventually arrive at your destination. But you have no internal map. You don't understand how the streets actually connect.
And mimicking accounts for roughly 50% of the behavior observed in traditional classrooms. Half the room is just pattern matching.
Wait, hold on a second. If a student is mimicking the steps perfectly and they get 100% on the worksheet, isn't that still a win? Like, they're completing the task they were assigned. Why do we penalize mimicking if the end result is accurate?
Well, the danger lies in what cognitive scientists call fragile procedural knowledge. It's essentially a house of cards. The student hasn't actually learned a mathematical concept. They have merely memorized a choreography of symbols.
A choreography of symbols, I like that.
And the fatal flaw of mimicking is exposed the moment the parameters of the problem change even slightly. Like, what happens when the variable is suddenly on the other side of the equal sign? Or what if the problem is presented as a word problem instead of just a raw equation?
Ah, the GPS dies, and they are completely stranded.
Precisely. Without a conceptual map, their entire system collapses. Because they don't know why they were moving that number to the other side of the equation, they cannot adapt the procedure to a new scenario. The illusion of learning is shattered right there. The teacher assumed the student understood algebra because yesterday's worksheet was flawless, but the student was merely playing a really complex game of visual matching.
Okay, but why are they defaulting to this in the first place? If mimicking is so fragile and faking requires so much like performative energy, why not just engage with the underlying logic? I mean, it feels like we are still sort of circling the idea that they just don't want to work hard.
Yeah, and this is where we have to look past behavior and actually examine biological capacity.
Biological.
Yes, the reliance on mimicking isn't a motivational deficit. It is an architectural limitation of the human brain. Specifically, we have to look at John Sweller's cognitive load theory. Have you heard of this?
Briefly, yeah.
Yeah.
It maps out the biological bottleneck of working memory, right?
Exactly. Working memory is the cognitive space where you actively hold and manipulate information in real time. It is the processor of the brain, and its capacity is shockingly small.
If working memory is the bottleneck causing all this mimicking, it must be incredibly limited. I remember reading it can only hold a few discrete items at any one time.
Yeah, the established consensus is that a typical human working memory can only hold about 3 to 7 discrete chunks of information simultaneously.
3 to 7. That's nothing.
It gets worse. Furthermore, if you don't actively rehearse or encode that information into long-term memory, it degrades and vanishes in roughly 30 seconds.
30 seconds. That is an incredibly narrow window to process complex mathematics.
It is a razor-thin margin for error. So Sweller's theory breaks down the mental effort placed on this limited working memory into 3 distinct types of cognitive load. First is intrinsic load.
Okay.
This is the inherent, unavoidable difficulty of the material itself. The mathematical concept of a quadratic equation just naturally requires more cognitive processing power than basic addition. You cannot change the intrinsic load without changing the subject matter entirely.
Right. I mean, calculus is always going to be intrinsically heavier than fractions.
Exactly. The second type is extraneous load, and this is the primary culprit in our failing classrooms.
Extraneous load.
Yeah. Extraneous load is the mental effort wasted on navigating poor instructional design. It is the cognitive friction generated by the environment itself. Imagine a worksheet with tiny margins, poorly formatted equations, and confusing instructions.
Oh, I've seen those.
Or imagine a teacher verbally explaining a complex concept while simultaneously projecting a slide full of dense text. The student's brain is forced to split its processing power between decoding the visual text and listening to the audio. All of this burns through those 3 to 7 chunks of working memory without contributing to actual learning at all.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because it sounds exactly like a computer's RAM. Like if you have 50 browser tabs open, which represents all that extraneous load, the chaotic room, the confusing worksheet, the split attention, the computer's RAM is maxed out.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if you have a top-of-the-line processor. If you try to open a heavy software program, the entire system just freezes because there is simply no RAM left to execute the command.
That analogy perfectly captures the biological reality, which brings us to the third type, germane load.
Germane load.
Right. This is the productive cognitive effort used to actually build long-term memory schemas. It's the brain power used to connect new information to existing knowledge and synthesize true understanding. But if intrinsic load and extraneous load have already consumed the working memory capacity, germane processing simply cannot occur. Learning is biologically blocked.
But let me challenge this for a second. If a student is overwhelmed by the extraneous load, shouldn't they just, focus harder? We constantly tell kids to apply more grit, to pay closer attention. Can't sheer willpower force the brain to process the information?
You cannot outwill a biological bottleneck. Effort cannot expand the physical limits of working memory. To see this in action, look at the concept of automaticity.
Automatic.
Yeah, let's say a middle school student is trying to solve a multi-step algebraic equation. To succeed, they need their working memory available to process the algebraic logic, the intrinsic load. But suppose this student never achieved automaticity in basic multiplication. When they encounter, say, 7 times 8 in the middle of the equation, they don't instantly retrieve the answer 56 from long-term memory.
They have to stop and actually calculate it manually, like maybe count by sevens or use repeated addition on their fingers.
Exactly, and that manual calculation requires active processing. Suddenly, their entire working memory, all 3 to 7 chunks, is completely hijacked by basic arithmetic. There is zero capacity left to hold the algebraic variables in their mind. The task mathematically exceeds their biological capacity.
Wow.
When this happens, the brain experiences what we call a cognitive overload hold. The system crashes. The student experiences a physiological freeze where they literally cannot process another piece of information.
So when a kid is staring blankly at a page or resting their head on the desk, they aren't necessarily being defiant or lazy. Their cognitive architecture has completely locked up. The extraneous noise was too loud, the intrinsic demand was too high without that automaticity, and the RAM has crashed.
And they are left sitting there, completely overwhelmed, while the teacher just continues with the lesson, assuming everyone is following along.
Man. So we have this cognitive overload happening daily for millions of students. What does that actually do to a person's psyche? Like, if you are a student experiencing this biological shutdown day after day, year after year, how does that shape your self-concept?
It leads to the construction of a deeply protective yet highly damaging mathematical identity. I mean, we live in a society that readily embraces the myth of the math person.
Really?
We treat mathematics entirely differently than reading or writing. If a child struggles to read, we intervene, we say they need more practice, we view it as a skill to be acquired over time. But if a child struggles with math, the cultural messaging immediately shifts to genetics. Society tells them, well, maybe your brain just isn't wired for numbers.
It is incredibly pervasive. I mean, I hear highly educated adults say this constantly. Oh, don't ask me to calculate the tip. I'm just not a numbers person. It's almost worn as a badge of honor, like a socially acceptable excuse for incompetence.
Exactly. And students absorb this cultural messaging. After experiencing repeated cognitive overload and the public failure that inevitably follows in a classroom, the student looks for an explanation. Rather than understanding the nuances of working memory and instructional design, which they obviously wouldn't know, they adopt the myth.
Yeah.
They internalize the belief that they are fundamentally genetically broken when it comes to mathematics.
And once that identity is established, their daily behavior in the classroom makes total sense. Disengagement is no longer about laziness at all. It is a highly calculated strategy of self-preservation.
Right. It's protection.
Think about the social dynamics of a middle school classroom. If trying your absolute hardest still results in a cognitive crash and public failure in front of all your peers, then putting in effort is psychologically dangerous.
I know.
Faking, or slacking, becomes the most rational, safe choice. You can't really fail if you never actually try.
Spot on. Disengagement becomes their cognitive armor, and this response is hardwired into their neurobiology. When a student who has internalized this negative identity is handed a complex math task, they experience genuine physiological math anxiety.
Like actual physical anxiety.
Yes, this is not just a mild nervousness about getting a bad grade. The brain's fear center, the amygdala, perceives the math test as a literal threat to the ego and survival. When the amygdala activates, it overrides and effectively disconnects the prefrontal cortex, which is the logic and reasoning center of the brain.
Whoa. The fear center literally hijacks the logic center.
Right.
They are thrust into a fight, flight, or freeze response while sitting quietly at a desk.
Exactly. The working memory capacity we just discussed is instantly consumed by the emotional regulation required just to manage the anxiety. Mathematical reasoning becomes physiologically impossible in that state.
So saying I'm bad at math is basically wearing armor to protect against the amygdala hijack. But wait, what if the environment changes temporarily? Like, say a teacher works incredibly hard, scaffolds a specific lesson perfectly, manages the cognitive load, and the student successfully masters the concept and gets an A on the test. Doesn't that undeniable success shatter the armor and rewrite the identity?
It should, right. But human psychology is incredibly stubborn, largely due to confirmation bias. Once a negative mathematical identity is firmly rooted, it acts as an impenetrable filter for reality. The brain actively seeks out evidence that confirms its existing beliefs to maintain cognitive consistency. So if the student fails a test, the brain says, see, I told you we aren't a math person, the identity is secure.
But if they succeed?
If they succeed, the brain experiences massive cognitive dissonance. It has to reconcile success with an identity of failure. And instead of updating the self-concept, which frankly takes immense psychological work and opens the door to higher expectations and potentially harder future failures, the brain simply attributes the success to external factors.
Oh, I see.
The student will convince themselves, oh, the test was just unusually easy, or the teacher basically gave me the answers, or I just got lucky this one time.
They will twist their own reality to maintain the identity of failure, because the armor, as heavy as it is, feels safe. It protects them from future disappointment.
Yeah. The armor becomes a psychological prison. Because they refuse to internalize their success, their self-efficacy never improves. And without improved self-efficacy, the amygdala will inevitably trigger the exact same anxiety response the very moment the next lesson begins.
So what does this all mean? We have all these distinct phenomena operating under the surface. We have the taxonomy of mimicking and faking, the biological bottleneck of working memory, the chaos of extraneous load, the amygdala hijacking the prefrontal cortex, and the rigidity of confirmation bias. How do all these pieces actually connect in the day-to-day reality of a school?
Well, when you synthesize the research, you don't just see isolated problems. You see a single devastating systemic pipeline that operates sequentially in traditional classrooms. It is a cyclical pattern of cause and effect that drives 80% of students into non-thinking behaviors. It basically unfolds in 5 distinct stages.
Okay, what's stage one?
Stage 1 is adaptation.
Setting the stage, basically.
Right. Students walk into a physical environment designed for passive reception desks arranged in rigid rows, all facing a central authority figure at the front of the room. This fronted architecture offers the comfort of anonymity. Students immediately adapt to this spatial design by settling in to hide and observe rather than actively participate.
Which leads right into stage 2, overload. The instructional model relies heavily on the teacher talking, demonstrating, and projecting information simultaneously. This completely spikes the extraneous cognitive load. Combine that friction with the lack of foundational automaticity we talked about, and the student's incredibly narrow working memory bottleneck is completely overwhelmed. The biological RAM crashes.
Exactly. Because the working memory is overloaded, germane processing cannot happen. They literally cannot build conceptual schemas, which inevitably forces stage 3, failure.
Right.
To survive the immediate demands of the worksheet, the overloaded student relies on mimicking the teacher's physical steps. But because mimicking creates fragile procedural knowledge, the system collapses the moment the test parameters change. They fail the assessment.
Which hardwires stage 4, identity. Repeated exposure to the cycle of overload and failure, despite their genuine attempts to mimic and survive, convinces the student that the cultural myth is actually true. They solidify the belief that they are fundamentally genetically bad at math.
And finally, to protect that fragile negative identity from the biological pain of an amygdala hijack, they reach the final stage, disengagement. The student permanently resorts to the non-thinking behaviors. They stall, they fake, they slack, they withdraw entirely. The cycle is complete, and the armor is locked firmly in place.
Looking at this entire pipeline from a macro perspective is just profound. When you trace the line from the physical placement of a desk to the biological limits of a 30-second memory span to the neurochemistry of fear, you realize something fundamental. A student resting their head on a desk in math class isn't a glitch in the system. It isn't a character flaw or a lack of grit. It is the most logical, biological, and psychological response a human being could possibly have to that specific environment.
Really is.
I mean, the traditional classroom is perfectly engineered to produce the exact disengagement we are constantly complaining about.
That is the inescapable conclusion of the data. We are placing human brains into an architecture that actively violates the biological rules of how those brains actually process information and learn. And then tragically, we are punishing the students for naturally adapting to the parameters we forced upon them in the first place.
So for you listening, whether you're navigating your own learning, your children's education, or even how you structure training in your profession, there are 4 critical takeaways from this deep dive. First, thinking must be intentionally required by the environment.
Absolutely.
The research heavily points to modern, disruptive frameworks, like installing vertical whiteboards around the perimeter of the room where everyone must stand up and using visibly random groupings. These physical changes destroy the anonymity of seated rows and literally force cognitive engagement. I mean, you cannot hide at a vertical whiteboard.
You really can't. Second, we must recognize that people adapt to the systems they inhabit. If an environment rewards quiet compliance and visual mimicking, human beings will optimize for mimicking. But if the system is redesigned to reward productive struggle, messy mistakes, and shared reasoning, they will adapt to think.
Third, cognitive load, not raw intelligence, is the ultimate bottleneck of capacity. We have to respect the biological limits of working memory. Stripping away extraneous noise and building foundational automaticity isn't, dumbing things down. It is clearing the runway so the brain can actually take off.
And finally, mathematical identity, or really any intellectual identity, is constructed through repeated environmental experiences, not genetics. Math people are not born. They are cultivated in environments that normalize friction, manage cognitive capacity, and reward perseverance rather than mere performance.
Which brings us to the ultimate, authoritative closing insight of this deep dive. The core crisis plaguing our math classrooms is absolutely not a lack of student ability, and it never was.
No, the human brain is extraordinarily capable of complex mathematical reasoning. The crisis is a catastrophic failure of instructional design. We can unlock that inherent capacity, but only if we engineer environments that actually support the biological limits of memory and respect the realities of human psychology.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as you step back into your day. We spent this time exploring how a specific environment, the arrangement of desks, the delivery of instruction, the unmanaged cognitive demands, can completely shape a person's capacity and forge an identity of failure, convincing them that they are fundamentally broken when in reality, the room was just designed poorly. So look around your own life, in your workplace dynamic, your daily routines, or even your personal relationships. Where else are you mistaking a design flaw for a personal failure?